We will get started now. All right, hello everyone. I'm Amy Clausen, the Director of Finance and Marketing here at the Niagara-on-the-Lake Museum. And today is our last webinar in our weekly series that we've been doing since May. So thank you for coming out today. If you've attended any 1812 events in Niagara-on-the-Lake, then you are probably familiar with today's entertaining speaker. Scott Finley started working for Parks Canada in the early 2000s, first as a heritage interpreter at Fort George, and is now the corporate program officer. Scott portrayed Major General Sir Isaac Brock during the bicentennial, and he was very involved with the steampunk events at Fort George. But Scott doesn't just know about the War of 1812. He also researches and interprets First World War history, and today he will be presenting 10 things that will save your life in the trenches. I will be monitoring the Q&A box and the chat box on your window there, so if you have any questions or comments for the speaker today, feel free to type them in there, and I will field them to Scott at the end of the presentation. And I will turn it over to you now, Scott.
Thank you very much, Amy. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. Nothing puts a smile on my face like visiting the museum, and that's where I insisted we do this from, because I'm such a techno peasant I couldn't figure out how to do it from my own home. Anyway, this 10 things that could save your life in the trenches goes to a situation that you may have heard about before, but we were and by we, there was 3 of us from this area and a couple from out Toronto way, were asked to go to the commemorative for the Battle of Vimy. And that would be like 3 years ago now, 3 or 4 years ago, I guess. And our job specifically was to talk to Canadian students. And there were thousands of them, quite literally. It really had a ton of Canadian students. I think at the actual site, commemoration, there was over 20,000 Canadian students there. So the day before and the day after, they had a huge lecture hall, and specifically what we were set up to do was to explain what was the medical response for these soldiers that were wounded when they were in the trenches or in no man's land, but at least at the front lines. And so we talked about the 10 most important things that probably happened or came out of it. And one of the first ones speaks to the technology of that particular war. When you think of the First World War, it's just like the Second World War in that it goes from a transition of this is how they think they're going to fight it, and by the end of it, this is how we ended up fighting it. And a lot of that had to deal with new technology that they were able to create very, very quickly. And specifically when you think of, too, these armies that are facing off each other, the common thought process is it's going to be a very fast war. It's going to be a lot of cavalry units, and they're going to be making sweeping movements across the battlefields, and that line is going to move quickly. And what happens is just the opposite. When they do come in contact with each other, and there's a very, very good book, I wish I could tell you what the title was, by a Canadian physician who actually talks about that day when they finally dig in, and how the digging in process is just like, okay, well, maybe you should get down a bit lower, dig out something. And from those little foxholes suddenly starts to develop this whole trench idea. And of course, by the Middle War, you have trenches that stretch all the way from the Swiss border all the way up to the English Channel. So trench warfare is a static type of warfare, and it means that you have 2 heavily armed foes facing each other. So how do you do as much damage as possible? And this first thing on our list is really an indicator of how you can do so much damage. The first one that I believe that was used, if I'm not mistaken, was this. I'll hold that right up there, and that's mustard gas. The story goes that it was at the Battle of Ypres in Belgium, where the Canadians were on the front line, the French and the British were kind of the wings on the other side of them, and the Germans used that opportunity to use mustard gas for the very first time. This was technology that had been heavily debated, even on their side, and its delivery was not what we thought. Think of it in terms of gas shells coming in. They actually had large tubes that they were trying to pump the gas onto the battlefield. According to stories about that particular altercation, what happened was that when the gas hit the lines, the French contingent immediately withdrew. And the British held on for a bit, and then they withdrew as well. The Canadians, and this is the story that goes along with it, survive and keep in their positions. And how do they do so? They have a junior officer who was a chemist in real life, and he realized what was going on, and he gave probably one of the strangest commands ever given on a battlefield, which he said, "Gentlemen, find your handkerchiefs, urinate on them, and hold them over your face." And it was, of course, the contingent portions of what is normally found in urine, which neutralized that mustard gas at that time. So when the advancing German line came over, they thought they had cleared out the front, and they were quite surprised to find that the Canadian soldiers were still there and still quite capable of fighting. So mustard gas is one of the choices they had. Here's another one that probably heard of, chlorine. This one's kind of scary when you think about this. A couple of years ago, and we're going to get to that one. Something happened in St. Catharines, which after reading about these things really scared the heck out of me. Tear gas, of course, the way that was used on the battlefield, it was a much heavier concentrated form of tear gas than are used in by police officers or those types of things to control crowds. This was the big one. This one is the last one really that's developed, and it's phosgene. Now, the interesting thing about these particular other gases is that you can kind of tell what it is by the scent that it gives off. This one, the mustard gas, the side effects are coughing, vomiting, chemical burns, blisters, blindness, intense pain. Chlorine, coughing, vomiting, irritation to throat and eyes, headaches, asphyxiation. Tear gas, irritation to eyes, mouth, nose, breathing, temporary blindness. Phosgene, though. Why this phosgene is so terrible is that you really can't smell it. When it comes in, it blends in with the smells that they'd be familiar with in the trench, those earthy smells, the natural smells, so they would be unaware of it. And the other thing with phosgene is it could kill you almost instantly. There are a number of instances where soldiers have described crossing no man's land and seeing troops that are there in position ready to go forward, and then realize that they're all dead. They just kind of dropped where they were. So how do they deal with this? Well, medically speaking, here's something right here. It's a remedy for poisonous gas by Burgoyne Burbridge's company from London. And I'll open it up for you. What they suggested you do is you take one of these capsules and you break it open and inhale the vapor. And it was a neutralizing agent that was supposed to offset that. In keeping with the original order that was given, the first mask that's used to protect yourself against gases, this is what it looked like. Okay, you can kind of see that there. It has a very thick absorbent pad inside there, and that would have been probably had an addition of ammonia or some other neutralizing agent in it. And when you smelled the gas, you took it out, you put it over and tied it behind your back, or behind your head, I should say. It's because of its limitations, it wasn't incredibly successful, much better than nothing at all, of course. So, and what's interesting when I mentioned earlier is you have this whole mechanization of war, the whole technology of war is constantly moving along throughout the First World War. This one might be a little bit more familiar that you may have seen before. If I can hold that up, right? And this actually is a hood. It goes over top, and you'll see right at the very front here, of course, there's this kind of little flap thing. And the idea was not to breathe through it. The idea actually was to pull this on and breathe through the fabric when you're breathing in, because it's been treated. All right, it would stop that gas from going in. And when you exhaled, there's kind of a mouthpiece, almost similar to a scuba mouthpiece. That my battery's running low, so that's good to know. So this will be a very short talk, folks. Amy, if you can hear this, you probably want to bring in some power of some sort. Anyway, so this was the next manifestation. The problem with this, of course, it's not very tight fitting. It doesn't fit necessarily over the shoulders. It's kind of limited in that fashion. So what you do find, the next one, which takes probably a couple of years before they actually bring it to use, and it's something that we think far more of. Yes, I'm running out of juice. I'm just about to put some poisonous gas in to see if that'll kind of make it jacked up there a bit. But see, this one, of course, has a huge filtration system on it, a very tight-fitting face mask that still has that breathing apparatus inside. You could breathe out of it. This was far, far more effective than what they'd had before. Now, when I was talking about phosgene, and as I said, this kind of struck home a few years back. If you recall this, there was a transport truck that turned over, I believe, somewhere close to Lake Street in the QEW. It was on the QEW. And interestingly enough, what it was carrying was phosgene. And that's when they had to get everybody out of that area. They were looking like, I think it was almost a kilometer circle around where that truck was. They had to get them out of there. And certainly in its purest form, if phosgene had been released at this time, there would have been some tremendous damage done to people. To this day, I have yet to find out why it was carrying phosgene or what phosgene could possibly be used for, aside from having the cleanest pool in the neighborhood. I don't know. But so these are their responses, at any rate, to when they were dealing with gas attacks. And I, like anything else, the first time is a tremendous shock, and the second time, it is. We're just getting a battery plugged in here. If you see Amy's arm all of a sudden, but they started to adapt. They started to get much better. Their response, of course, to when gas would come in was much faster than, of course, initially when they had to deal with it. The next thing, and the 10 things that will save your life, are vaccinations. Now, vaccinations are pretty rudimentary still at that point. Certainly, smallpox was the first one off the shelf almost a century prior to that. And they were able to deal with some of the minor issues. As we so well know, towards the end of the war, they were dealing with something they just were not. Hey, very good. All right, folks. I hope we're back. How terribly First World War that was. Suddenly, all the lights went out. Went dark. The computer didn't work. Well, at any rate, we're just letting Amy get back into her control room, and we'll move on. I was just mentioning, of course, about vaccinations. First World War, in these particular times, we are painfully aware of it because, of course, what they had to deal with in terms of the Spanish flu. And you can see there's some very good documentaries on that to show you the progression of how that particular disease morphed and changed and went up and went down and did tremendous damage. So they really couldn't wrestle that. So it was still rudimentary, but it was better, certainly, than what they were dealing with before. And where you would probably see the greatest impact was with using antiseptics. They did have a number of different things. I've got, now this one isn't a vaccination by any stretch of imagination, but this is aquaflavine powder, and that would be used in an open wound, certainly to help stave off things that might do some serious damage to you. Number 3 in our list of top 10 things is, it seems so obvious when I tell you this, you're probably going to want somebody to think of that. This is a field dressing pack, all right? hold that right up there so you can see it. Inside, you would find a gauzy material as well as a safety pin. And if you were going over the top, you would be given 2 of these, and you would pin them to the inside of your uniform. And the reason being is if you were injured, you could then take that out and put that bandage on and stop blood flowing, or at least protect it from infection or any number of things. It seems like such an obvious thing to provide to soldiers, but this is a big deal when this comes out, and as you can imagine, has tremendous impact on survival rates, because the soldiers are actually able to stop themselves from bleeding out before they do. So this was a big one, field package. The next one is the Canadian Medical Corps itself, modeled very closely on its British cousin. The Canadian Army Corps or Medical Corps, I should say, was there to provide the best physicians they possibly could. And it's very interesting when you look at kind of the lay of the land there. You're getting obviously off the top, you're getting the young doctors, some who may not have yet graduated from medical school, but they're young, they're healthy, they're eager, they're fresh with knowledge, if a little less on the expertise part of it. By the end of the war, it's not uncommon to see men my age, 65 years old, working in the front of the trench lines, because they desperately needed that expertise. They needed that experience that would save these soldiers when they're brought in. And there would be, this is a very interesting thing too that didn't happen very often before, was they would have that kind of level of a physician right at the point when that young man is brought off of the field. He would go from there, usually by ambulance if it was some distance, to the field hospital. So what you'd have is in the front lines, you'd have trenches and a trench area that was set up specifically to deal with those issues. And these very well-trained physicians, of course, would make decisions. They would have to look at it. And when they did, they used one of these tags. This is a tag that would have been attached to the soldier's uniform, probably the tunic pocket. And on it, they would have, of course, their name and their serial number down there and their rank. And then they would have their diagnosis of what they think is wrong, what's going on, what the treatments were that they gave to that soldier at that time, and then they would sign it. And it was a very, you can imagine, very hard emotionally, this particular job, because you'd have these young men come in. Sometimes it was as simple as, it's a flesh wound, we'll patch you up, give you back your rifle. Over the top you go. Other times, though, it would be, all right, you have this internal shot and you've got this and this. We just can't deal with you. Let's try and stabilize this person as best as possible. Get them to the field hospital, where you have a dedicated staff there that is just dealing with these and can do so in an operating environment. And then, of course, there's the other ones where you look at it and you go, there's nothing we can do. And quite frequently, very close by to where this station was on the front lines would be an area, either a tent or a back tunnel or whatever, where they would take these young men and they would just be allowed to pass. And that was the decision that these doctors had to make, just like that, as they were going through it. They had a lot to deal with. There is one other group that really needs to be mentioned as well. The young men that were stretcher bearers. Many of them, for religious belief, as a result, you saw a lot of Hutterites and a lot of Mennonites who did not believe in war or being part of it, but they did believe in their ability to go and help those that are desperately in need. And that's what happened in no man's land. Essentially, if you were shot, you were asked to take your rifle and stick it in the ground, sticking up. so that they would be able to see you and they would be able to get to you. Somebody said that actually the first wave of Vimy, when they looked over the trench, it looked like a small forest because of all the rifles that were in the ground. But these young men, they were not armed. They were dressed in khaki. They had the Red Cross on their arm, and it was an understanding before the war that, of course, if somebody had a Red Cross on, they are a non-combatant. That you don't, shoot at them, whatever. Unfortunately, as the war progressed, there was a number of these young men that died from casualties suffered on the battlefield where they'd been intentionally shot at. Most common wound that they experienced was being shot in the back of the thighs or the buttocks. And when you think about it, when you're squatting down to pick up the litter with the soldier on it, you are a prime target, and that's when they would get hit. But they were brave beyond anyone's imagination when you consider that you're in that heavily armed situation and you're the only one that's really not carrying a gun. No way to protect yourself there. The next one is my favorite. And it's my favorite because of the statistics that are attached to it. All right. One of the worst things you could suffer from in the First World War was having your thigh bone broken. Now, in civilian life, that is not an occurrence that happens very often. Your thigh bone is, somebody once described it as being made out of concrete. I mean, it is the toughest bone in the human body. And aside from not plane crashes this time, but certainly train crashes or things of that nature, you wouldn't see them. The big problem with, of course, in a World War I environment is the artillery, the size of artillery, the rapidity of the artillery. When it hit you, you would see that there were situations where the tibia would break, or tibia, I get a little mixed up right now. At any rate, underneath this thigh bone, what you did have, of course, was the femoral artery. And that's a major artery that runs down your leg. It delivers blood down, and makes its way back up, whatever. But this bone is really there to protect it. Now, if you break that bone and you throw this man on a stretcher, and as you're going, that bone is doing this. Well, it can only do that for so long before it breaks the femoral artery or cuts into it. And that person will bleed out in very short time. Before they brought this particular apparatus, about to say, into play, 85% of men who had their thigh bone broken died. They just couldn't stabilize them. They couldn't deal with that situation. So this young Canadian doctor comes up with this apparatus, which had been invented before and had been used for people mainly with diseases of the bone, and it's called the Thomas Splint. Now, what's the Thomas Splint do? Well, it looks almost like a bracket that you would use for someone that had a walking problem, except what it did was it isolated the leg entirely. It wrapped around at the top of the hip. It went right down below the ankle, and that leg became absolutely immobile. And that way you could put them onto a stretcher. They could jostle around. They get the back of an ambulance. They bounce, whatever. That is not moving. And as a result of using that, of this young man saying, I saw this one somewhere, and getting these into play, that statistic of 85% of the men who suffered this injury dying reversed. 85% of the men who had the Thomas Splint survived. So for my money, that's a pretty good innovation, I think, when it comes along. This one, not so much on the Western front, but of course it was indeed a world war. Mosquito netting, all right? Particularly in the southern climes where it was a real problem. They were bringing this in, and this made a huge difference, of course. Tenting as well, and it meant that particularly with some of the more horrendous mosquitoes that were out there, but other tsetse flies of that nature, that sort of thing was marginalized. So that was a tremendous addition. I mentioned to you about the stretcher bearers and about the doctor. What they were creating was something that hadn't been in place before on a large battlefield. And what they were working to do was create speedy evacuation. In other words, if someone goes down, get them off of that field as quickly as possible, get them to the doctor as quickly as possible, get him, once he's analyzed and he's made those decisions as to what's wrong, into another stretcher, into an ambulance, get them to a field hospital where they're dealt with. And they would pride themselves on how fast they could do this. It was, and as a result, the faster you got an injured soldier from the battlefield to that hospital, the greater the chance, of course, they were going to survive. Of course, Canada has a really interesting addition to that whole process in terms of the ambulances. There was a young lady who decided that, and she thought about this very carefully, the women would make ideal ambulance drivers. And she went after the Minister of Defense right off the start and said, look, these young ladies are fit, they're healthy, they're good drivers, they have medical backgrounds in some instances, whatever, they would be perfect. And they kept getting turned down and kept getting turned down. And so eventually that minister was removed from his position. But the next one in, on the very first day he was there, the same lady was there in his office in the morning, and 3 hours later, the ambulance drivers being sent over were Canadian women. And they did a phenomenal job, just an absolutely amazing job. And if you do see pictures of them, they had these long black coats with the black peak cap and kind of a balloon trousers underneath it. And you could see them as a group. In a way, they were having the time of their life, but more importantly, they were saving the lives of others. You want to check your watches to see how long it takes for me to drop this particular system we switched over to, and hopefully I can get through without it dropping again. We were just talking about speedy evacuation and about the wonderful Canadian ambulance drivers. Number 8 on our list of the top things that could save lives seems obvious once again, but it was not in widespread use. And what it was dry warmth, essentially blankets. The more blankets you could put on these injured men, the better, particularly when you're trying to get them from one location to the other, and allowing the body to get warm and stay warm was a big savior. When we were doing this in Vimy, there was a French ambulance that was there, and interestingly enough, the exhaust actually went through the back where they would put the patients that they were moving. And your initial response is, what, are you trying to kill these guys? But what they looked at it was that gas that was coming out was warm, and it was actually flowing out, and there was adequate regular air coming in as well, that it didn't have that sort of impact, but they were able to keep everybody warm. And that was once again, seems obvious, but in the past it was one of those, well, one blanket's good enough for that group. The next one, number 9, sanitation. When you think of where they were and where they were fighting, it's amazing that more men didn't die because of infections or whatever. You look at these battlefields, they're farmers' fields. They've been heavily manured for the last 600 years. There's all sorts of things living inside there. And when the weather would turn and the trenches would get filled with, partially with water, that means you also have airborne, you have waterborne, you've got these guys, and they were getting sick, and they were getting things they'd never heard of before. Trench foot it just didn't exist before this war, and not, at least on a scale that would actually stop everybody from being able to do what they're supposed to. And so there was an order that went out, and it was rigid, and it was that as a soldier, you would not get trench foot.
And because there's ways we can deal with this, and if we find that you have, you would be punished. It would be almost like a court martial. You'd be sent back to some place with the fellows that tried to desert or had social diseases, and that's where you would go. And essentially, it was very, very simple. It was, the orders were that when you got off of your duty at that front trench and you're sloshing through water, first of all, get the boots off, get the socks off, clean your feet, put dry socks on, put dry boots on, and make sure that you are washing the others and stuffing your boots with whatever they could, probably newspaper, grass, whatever they could, but just to get them dry. And they really, really were stringent on this. And of course, the doctors, that would be probably one of the things they were doing the most of, which was every 3 days or so, they would go by and they would do a foot inspection. And, you know, you wanted to pass, really, you wanted to pass, because it really wasn't worth your while if you didn't. And, you know, there was a certain attitude that the king didn't spend all this money on you, just have you come over there and then get a free vacation back because you can't walk on your feet. That was kind of the attitude that went into to that. And the final one of the top 10 things, as I mentioned to you about the physicians that were there dealing with these problems, and at the front lines as well. And in the past, when they had to deal with injuries of that sort, it was really hodgepodge, get somebody there, and nothing happened until you saw a physician and that sort of thing. But now having a physician right at the front, they would carry with them a small surgical kit. I saw one when I was over in France. It was beautiful. It was an English officer's, medical officer's kit that he carried with him, and it was a solid silver case. And inside were these, you know, all the scalpels that he needed, the needles, the suture, everything he needed to do, basically minor surgery. But in the situation that where he was, if he could do that and stabilize the patient before he got shipped on, or even better, could actually, you know, get him to the point where, you know, get him sutured up and bandaged up and start the healing right off the bat and make sure it's all clean. He had at his disposal a small set of tools just to be able to do that. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is my 10 things that could save your life in the trenches. Thankfully, none of us plan on going into the trenches anytime soon, but what you can learn from that is a great history lesson, which is when a war of that scale starts, it seldom ends the way they think that it's going to start. And of course, say in the Second World War, same thing. We started off with a lot of artillery and end up with the nuclear age. And war is that great accelerator for that sort of technology. Thankfully, some of these things, as simple and straightforward as they seem, were a great boon to the young men who were actually able to survive because of it. Now, I once again have to wait for Amy to come back, and I think she's skulking around here somewhere. We have a little power problem, as you saw. My apologies for that. It was very authentic, though, to the First World War era in terms of things cutting in and out left and right. So I hope you appreciate that. Amy, you need to look at this, do you?
Sure, I'm just going to see if we have any questions.
Okay. I'll move over here.
You can read them right there if you want.
Okay. So let me just read them here. It says, is there one thing on your list that you feel is the most important? I would say the most important thing is the Canadian Army Medical Corps. Canada sent the people that needed to be sent. And in that particular war as well, no one shied away from it. They saw this as a very clear-cut duty to King and Crown, and that they were going to do their duty as Canadians. And as a result, they ended up with some highly skilled individuals. And I think that being able to use those in together with creating a very quick evacuation movement, I think those are the two things that probably save more lives than others. We've heard of mustard gas. Exactly what are the ingredients? Very interesting. Mustard. I don't know. I have to look at the bottle itself to find out what it was. So I can't help you there. But something. Yeah. Grab me some mustard gas while you're up, will you? We've all said that at home. We'll come back to that one. Let's see the next one. The soldiers were existing in wet trenches. How could they keep their spare boots and socks dry in such a setting? Well, there would have been some sort of probably fire-based heat source. And from what I understand, you did have a double on the boots. So you would dry one while you're wearing the other pair, and you go that way. Same thing with the socks, washing them. But they really were serious about this because it was pulling so many men out of the line that I'm sure that they would have provided for them to be able to do that switch, because it was far more important to have these soldiers in the line and on duty where you needed them, rather than them, be behind the lines with these terrible. And trench foot, it's not a pretty disease to get. It's not something, you want to see. There's also instances, I think, of trench mouth. And once again, it was something that they picked up because of ill-prepared food or whatever. So right off the bat, when you see that and you start to lose maybe 100 men a day to this sort of thing, it suddenly becomes a priority, and they really did put a lot of emphasis on dealing with that. But that's, they got the spare boots. Let's see what we got next. I would imagine many soldiers were saved by the judicious application of a tourniquet. Did the soldiers carry them? No, the stretcher bearers would have. But the soldiers really, as I said, only had that little pack that I showed you. It was filled with gauze material. Now, in a worst case scenario, if you had to try and stop the blood flow, and it was like particularly on a limb or something of that nature, where you could apply pressure, and tighten it around like a makeshift tourniquet, that was probably used like that as it was required. But it wasn't ever, they didn't give like a little, where you see in earlier wars, they'd have a little stick or something you could kind of crank around, They did have some fairly good tourniquets, but that would be farther down the line, not with the men out fighting. Now, did you find mustard gas? No, I'm curious to see what's in this too. Mustard. It doesn't really go into any details. It does state, though, mustard gas, in case you're interested, has a lilac and garlic scent. So if you're looking for that kind of springtime, Mediterranean food type of thing, mustard gas is the one you want. So I'm sorry I don't have a formula for you, and actually I'm quite glad I don't, because I probably shouldn't be giving it out if I did. But nasty stuff, and it really, these things still do exist today to a certain point, but they're just not the same intensity, and thankfully, and they're used for probably more important reasons than what they were using them for. That's certain. Is that yes? Oh, we got to slide down. My goodness. Okay. How am I doing? Oh, you're doing it. That's great. Okay. Don't forget the bluebirds. Absolutely vital in the saving of many lives. Absolutely. And forgive me for doing that. When the bluebirds are the Canadian nurses. They were amazing, to say the very, very least. The bluebirds, of course, coming from the color of their dresses. I would suspect that by the end of the war, if they did not have an encyclopedic knowledge of practical medicine, I would be shocked. They were just as important, if not more important, than the physician that was looking after these men. They provided not only sound medical assistance, but they were also there in an emotional standpoint as well, that they were there to help these soldiers get through that situation. And believe me, when you think you're going to be shuffling off this mortal coil, and there's somebody there that can talk you through the whole process, or if you end up doing that, to be there with you at the very end. it's amazing how strong these ladies were. I mean, emotionally strong like iron, and yeah, we owe them a tremendous debt. And thank you so much for mentioning that, because that is so important. I also believe the Canadian medical officer was the first to use blood transfusion on the battlefield. Yeah, I read about that too. Blood transfusion is really infancy at that time. They don't even understand fully the components of blood in terms of creating the right match and things. So it gets a little dicey, but I do recall that. I mean, the big one I think that I was probably more aware of was after the war, when you see Bethune over in China, and actually that would be after the next war, wouldn't it? So it's Bethune in the Spanish Civil War that I think I see there was a number of things of that. So yeah, very possible. I think I saw it. I didn't read a lot on it though, but that makes sense. Was not the development of steel helmets important? Yes, absolutely. And I wish I had my helmet right now, but I don't. But if you think of those British helmets, and of course Canadians wore similar ones, and they look like a pie plate, fit like this. And I always thought, gee, that's kind of a strange thing to be putting on top of your head, right? Particularly when you looked at the German troops who had those helms that came down, covered the ear. Once they got out of the pickle helmets, of course, it seemed like a much more, strategically placed helmet. But you have to realize what the helmets are for. If you had your helmet on and they were across the battlefield and a sniper lined you up, they could shoot right through your helmet into your head. It did not stop bullets. But what did it stop? It stopped, of course, artillery shells. There was so much artillery that was being fired constantly, and of course raining down on them. And if you had this shape of helmet with that lip sticking out, it's almost kind of covering your shoulders as well as it falls, but it's to save your life. So the steel helmets, yeah. Oh, without steel helmets, it would have been a very short war, I think. And why were the gases scented? Well, I thought I should do a commercial here right now. That's right. Well, if you're looking for a springtime gas, why were they scented? I think the scent actually was not done intentionally, but was something that was close to smelling like that was the result of the chemicals that they put together to create the gas. So it just so happened that if it smelled like this, you knew what it was that was coming in. And lilac and garlic scent in a trench, was going to be mustard gas. Now, if we got, let's see how, I'm going to try and do it. No, I'm not going to. Amy's going to do it. I'm not allowed to touch anything electronic now. Okay.
Thank you for me.
Okay. Oh, well, thank you everybody for listening and bearing out on the last talks. Like say we went out with a bang, but we went out with basically running out of power repeatedly and just blogging on. So just like the First World War, thank you for staying with us as we slogged along to get from an active computer to another active computer. And may I thank, of course, the museum as well for inviting me to be here. I don't have to tell you, you know that this is a startling gem in this community, and that all the support that we can give to make this a vital, and keep it a vital, it is already vital, keep it a vital hub of activity for our past, and as a result for our future as well. So thank you very much, folks. Have a great weekend.